it makes little difference whether you live in a totalitarian country or a private neurosis. Either way, you are apt to end up in a concentration camp where the whole point is to destroy the self as painfully as possible. Welcome to this video where we will delve deep into the complex topic of self-hate. Our focus will be on the theories of Horney and how she explains the root cause of self-hate. We will examine the concept of the idealized self and the journey one takes to become it. We will also explore the inner conflict that arises between the ideal self and the real self. We will understand the root cause of this monster and why it is so strong and merciless. We will then see how the person becomes a stranger to themselves and how people externalize the self-hate so that they don't feel it inside but project it onto the external world. And finally, end with all the tricks in which the self-hate can destroy people. Self-hate is a very complicated process that I'm going to try to break down into easy chunks. Of course, you're not going to watch a 20-minute video and all of a sudden get over all your issues. Unfortunately, it doesn't work like that. But with the understanding of this knowledge, you are going to start a journey in which every day will be better than the previous day, and hopefully one day you will wake up a free man. So buckle up and get ready to embark on a journey of self-discovery and growth. After a person focuses on becoming the idealized self so that he can feel powerful, this point of view distorts his view of the world and he starts to look at himself from the wrong perspective. The glorified self becomes not only a ghost to be pursued, it also becomes a measuring rod with which to measure his actual being. Of course, he is comparing his actual human self to a godlike perfection, so the person sees their real self as an embarrassment, and the person he actually is starts to interfere with the journey to becoming the ideal self. The ideal image happens because the person has psychological needs that aren't fulfilled, so they create a godlike image in their head to fill these needs. The journey that they take in order to become this godlike image is what we call the search for glory. Of course, this image is impossible to achieve for some reasons we're going to see later, but what people do is have neurotic claims so that they can put claims on themselves and the rest of the world in an attempt to prove that this image is real. An example is people who expect everybody else to stop doing whatever they are doing so that they can attend to that person, because that person feels like a god. These claims make the person have something called neurotic pride, and this is what leads us to self-hate. We talk about neurotic pride and all the issues in previous videos, so check those out if interested. No matter how hard the person tries to mold themselves into this godlike image, they are doomed to fail. The problem is that he has to live with himself. Whatever he eats, when he sleeps, when he goes to the bathroom, whether he makes love or goes to work, he is always there. He sometimes thinks that everything would be better if he just left his job or divorced his wife or moved to another place in the city. But the fact is that he must always go along with himself. Even if he functions like a well-oiled machine, it is still limited in energy, time, and power, just like a normal human being. Think of this as two people. There is that perfect ideal image, and there is his actual self, which is a stranger that keeps living with the ideal image. This stranger, which is his actual self, is always interfering, disturbing, and embarrassing the ideal person that the person feels they should be. Although the person is very successful on the outside, he always feels insecure and inferior. He will always have some feelings of being a bluff or a fraud or a freak. And he doesn't understand where these feelings come from. The actual empirical self becomes the offensive stranger to whom the idealized self happens to be tied. And the ideal self turns against this stranger with hate and contempt. The actual self becomes the victim of the proud idealized self. And this is where all the self-hate begins. But of course, the real self is not going to go down so easy. Therefore, a war starts in the person's mind. The person has two major wars going on in his unconscious mind. The first war is between the idealized self and the pride system. To elaborate, since the person has many rules, some of the rules are conflicting. He may want to be the most powerful person, but at the same time, he wants to be the humblest person. So such conflicting rules create a war. The second war or conflict is between the pride system and the real self. When a person is deep in self-hate, they can't really feel themselves, although they think that they can. They are driven by rules of the idealized self. But later in the recovery process, when the person starts to become healthier and starts to feel his own feelings, to know his wishes, to know his freedom of choice, and make his own decisions and assume responsibility for them, he starts to feel a strong fight between the idealized self and the real self. Now the idealized self no longer hates the limitations of the real self as much, but now the ideal self hates the fact that the real self is becoming stronger. So this is something we call the central inner conflict. Now there are three selves. One is the real self, which is a genuine you. There is the actual self, which is what you actually are right now. It is a mixture between the real self and the ideal self. Then there is the idealized self, which is a false image that the person wants to become. Now, the hate for the real self is in the background of the mind, but it always creates the present background of self-hate. People normally only feel the hate for the limitations of the actual self not being the idealized self. Of course, this is confusing, but let us use an example that can help correct the confusion. A good example is a person who is being ruthless at themselves for being selfish, for doing something that is in their interest. It may be both a hate for not measuring up to the absolute of saintliness, and this could also be a way to crush the person's real self. So we can see that two things are happening in one activity. As a German poet correctly put it, we do not hate ourselves because we are worthless, but because we are driven to reach beyond ourselves. The hatred, he says, results from the discrepancy between what I should be and what I am. There is not only a split, but a cruel and murderous battle. The power and tenacity of self-hate is outstanding. Now, of course, the idealized self has a lot of anger and rage because it is being humiliated and held down by the actual self. The person wants to be this cool person, but his real self is pulling him back, and he hates it for that. But he must live with it because the idealized self depends on the actual self for existence. And now this very dependency makes self-hate even more cruel and merciless because the idealized self just wants to escape and run away because it's just tied to this actual body. We can see that self-hate is not only the result of self-glorification, but also serves to maintain it. When the person hates themselves for these imperfections, that also confirms the godlike standards that they have. This is why it gets confusing, because when you talk to the person, you might think that they're going to be eager to get rid of this hate, but sometimes they don't want to get rid of it. Of course, this is unconscious. The person realizes the burden and danger of the self-hate, but he also finds it dangerous to rebel against the idealized self. The last factor that makes the self-hate dangerous and bad is the alienation from himself. The person no longer feels himself. He must first feel some sympathy for himself in order to realize that beating himself down is not the best way to go forward in life. The problem is that he cannot feel himself however much he beats himself down. But why can't he feel himself? Do most people really know that they have self-hate? During short intervals, people may feel like, I hate myself or I despise myself. But this only happens when the person is stressed, and after the stress goes away, they totally forget. Self-hate normally is a very subconscious thing. The person never asks himself whether such thoughts are a temporary response to failure, or does he actually have an everlasting issue of self-hate in his mind. Now, of course, different people have different awareness of self-hate, but the conclusion is that even those neurotics who are aware of their self-hate are not aware of how dangerous or how intense it is, and they're also not aware of the futility of their goals. They see these standards as a testimony to their high moral sensitivity. They do not question if their goals and standards are valid. Although not all neurotics are aware of their self-hate, all of them are aware of the results of the self-hate. They are feeling guilty, feeling inferior, feeling restricted, feeling tormented, but they never realize that these feelings are brought about by themselves. Even the little awareness they may have can be blurred by the pride they have. So if someone is suffering from feeling cramped down by everybody, then they become proud of being unselfish, self-sacrificing, slave of duty, things like that. So they don't see it as a problem to solve. We can see that although self-hate is mostly an unconscious process, the results are unfortunately not unconscious, because the person can actually feel them. Interestingly, the person actually has tricks that they can use so that they are not aware of this negative impact. Let's look into those. There are two types of externalization. The first one is active externalization, where the self-hate is directed towards life, fate, institutions, and other people. The second type, passive externalization, the people hate themselves, but they feel like it's coming from the outside, and the outside is causing these issues. Their internal issues are really seen as coming from outside. There are 6 main expressions of self-hate. There is relentless demands on the self, merciless accusations of the self, self-contempt, self-frustrations, self-tormenting, and finally, self-destruction. In the previous video, we saw how people create a set of rules to follow as a way to transform their actual self into their idealized image. But these demands on the self are not a choice. It's a kind of tyrannical demand where the person feels coerced. We can see why the person feels coerced. These rules that people have are determined by self-hate and by the ideal image. Self-hate unfortunately punishes people when its needs are not fulfilled. We can think of it as a person who is on gunpoint. There is a gun on his head and the gunman is saying, either you give me all you have or else I'll shoot you. Funnily enough, this gunman is probably going to be more humane than the person's treatment to themselves. It is possible for a person held at gunpoint to survive by complying, but unfortunately, the shoulds cannot be appeased. Remember that the idealized self can never be realized because of its conflicting rules. The shoulds are very destructive because they put a person in a straitjacket and he has no freedom. He has to act in a certain way if he is to survive. Even if he perfects his behavior to meet the ideal, he does this at the expense of his authentic feelings and beliefs. The second reason is that an individual can also impose tasks upon himself which are detrimental to his whole being. A classic example of this kind is to be found in Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. Raskolnikov, in order to prove his Napoleonic qualities, felt that he should be able to kill a human being. Nothing was more distasteful to his sensitive soul than to kill. He had to beat himself into doing it. The third factor which makes shoulds very destructive and also coercive is the self-hate that people feel when they violate them. If a person has not been as helpful as they feel they should be, then although they might not be aware of the violation, they may out of the blue just feel uneasy, fatigued, and anxious. Sometimes people experience the conscious awareness of violating their shoulds, but then they experience them in ways that protect themselves from the self-hate, like eating sprees, drinking sprees, shopping sprees, and sometimes they feel victimized by others or irritable at others. These are external tricks used to protect themselves. Now, when a person is about to find out that they cannot measure up to these shoulds, they will start acting weird. A good example is a patient who was very reasonable and cooperative and all of a sudden became agitated and went on a wild spree of accusing everybody. His relatives exploit him, his boss isn't fair, his dentist messed up his teeth, this analysis does him no good. But if we look really deep into these claims, we can see that the person is making neurotic claims. And if you remember, neurotic claims are caused by unfulfilled needs. The person has suddenly increased his claims, so he has a sudden increase of needs. Now we can understand that his distress is coming from him approaching the realization that he cannot fulfill all of his shoulds. So he unconsciously becomes panicky because he feels like he should be able to overcome all these odds. The person then has two alternatives. One is to realize that the demands on himself are fantastic and they're too much. And the second is that his life should be changed so that he does not have to face this failure. Of course, we want the first. But people, interestingly, have a way of protecting themselves from this distress. If the person gets a dim realization of a failure or impending failure that they will not be able to measure up to the shoulds, they can go into despair and the person will do whatever they can to avoid such a realization. One way that people avoid this realization is by fulfilling all the shoulds that they can in their imagination. The reason they want to fulfill these shoulds is so that they do not come to the terror of coming face to face with the fact that they cannot measure up to all the inner rules. Self-hate is a vicious cycle that stems from the pressure to become an idealized self. The actual self and the idealized self are constantly at war, creating a never-ending cycle of self-hate. Understanding the root cause of self-hate can help individuals break free from this cycle and embrace their true selves. Stay tuned for the second part of 3 in this mini video series on self-hate. Thank you. Thank you for watching. If you like this video, please like it and subscribe to the channel. And also check out my other videos. Have a good day.